So for the gospel reading this morning, I've chosen a passage from John's Gospel again, and it's an argument that Jesus is having with some of the Pharisees about the notion of the bread of life. So they said to him, "Then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? Our fathers ate manna in the wilderness, as is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus then said to them, "Truly, truly I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." These are words inspired by God. So as I continue today with the theme of Eucharist and the notion of real presence, I'm reminded of a story I heard many, many years ago from the Bible Belt in our country here, where a pastor is in the river, waist high in the water, and he's baptizing some followers in order that they might find Jesus. And a drunken guy wanders by and he's looking at these people getting dunked in the water, and he's wondering, what the hell is happening here? So he asked somebody, what's happening? And they told him they're coming down in order to find Jesus. So the pastor sees him, come in. And he comes into the water and he's waist high, and the pastor dunks his head under the water for about 30 seconds and comes back up and the guy's spluttering. And the pastor says to him, "Have you found Jesus?" And the drunk says, "No, not yet." He dunks him a second time, comes back up, "Have you found Jesus?" No, I haven't found Jesus yet." He dunks him a third time and he comes back up and says, "Have you found Jesus?" And the drunk man says, "No, I haven't. Are you sure this is where he fell in?" So this for me is the notion of real presence. What does it actually mean to be in the real presence of Christ? So I took as my theme for January and February, Eucharist and real presence. And on January 5th, I looked at the history of religious meals and feasts in many, many traditions, including in the Catholic one. And then last Sunday, I talked about the notion of the real presence in the Eucharist. So today I'm going to do a recap of those two and then open it up to a Q&A. And then, God willing, in February the 2nd and the 9th, I want to look at the Eucharistic Prayer of the Cosmos that Marilyn Water helped direct. And then February 16th, a recap. So 2 weeks ago, I had a quick look at the notion of sacred meals throughout history. And I talked about the fact that all worship and all sacred meals involve some kind of an altered state of consciousness. And all peoples and all religions have experimented with different ways in order to induce altered states of consciousness, in order to try to ascend through the various bodies and the various sheaths of consciousness from our mere kind of our sensory experience and the left brain processes into intuition and right brain processes, and finally into the soul and cosmic consciousness. And so we've discovered lots and lots of different ways of altering our state of consciousness. So sometimes it's done through plant medicine. It can be done through dancing, through drumming, through music, through davening in the Jewish tradition, to the whirling dervishes in the Sufi tradition. It can be achieved through meditation, through fasting, spending time in a sensory deprivation chamber, tantric sex, prayer, ritual, holotropic breath work, incense, which assails the nostrils and creates an altered state, induced near-death experiences, which was actually practiced by the Egyptians. They would create a near-death experience for a pharaoh who wanted to become a pharaoh in order to travel to the other side and have access to the other side while he was ruling. Then you had natural death experiences, near-death experiences, where people were temporarily dead and came back and reported what was at the other side. We can access it through our imagination. We can access it through what Hinduism will call divine madness, or we can access it by praying in a foreign language, a sacred language, and we don't understand it rationally, but there's something about the acoustics. When you pray in Sanskrit or Latin and Hebrew, there's something about these sacred languages which, even if you don't understand rationally what they're saying, it creates an altered state of consciousness. So then I looked at a few different traditions, beginning with shamanism. And remembering that in my time in Africa, that indigenous societies very often, before drinking anything, before having a meal, they would pour a libation to the ancestors. They would pour something, what they were about to drink, onto the ground to honor the ancestors. And that created an altered state of consciousness because it took you outside of time. And now you're in the realm of the ancestors. Shamans had their own form of Eucharist, plant medicine, whether it was peyote or ayahuasca or soma. And it's interesting that the altered states of consciousness created by plants have been given very many different kinds of names. Sometimes they're called hallucinogenics. Sometimes they're called mind-altering substances. Sometimes they're called psychedelics. One term is entheogen. And entheogen literally means creating God's presence. Theo from God. So entheogen means to create the presence of God in some fashion. Shamanism was big into creating altered states of consciousness by dancing, by drumming, by sweat lodges, by walkabout in Australia, and by vision quests. So shamanism had many, many different ways of creating an altered state of consciousness. The ancient Greeks had a brilliant system called the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was a really profound and completely secretive religious tradition centered upon the experience of death and the afterlife and rebirth, that you could literally be led through the experiences of these three states, of the death state, the afterlife state, and the rebirth state. And they used substances to induce these altered states of consciousness. And you had great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle who went through that process. We find them beginning about the second millennium before the Common Era, right down to the 4th century in our own time, when it was suppressed by the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, who was a Christian. So that was kind of the Eleusinian one. The Jews had their own version in the Seder meal. And the origin of the Seder meal can be traced back to the biblical story of the Exodus, when the slaves are coming out of Egypt. And they have to come out in such a hurry that they don't have time to use leavened bread. They can't put leaven in the bread. So they have to cook the bread, bake the bread really, really quickly. Now, so you're going to find that right down to the time of Jesus and a little bit afterwards. But then a major part of that was that the lamb of sacrifice had to be killed in the temple. No matter where in Israel you came from, you had to come down to Jerusalem to the temple and have the lamb sacrifice that you then ate for your Seder meal. But the second temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. And so this central ritual of sacrificing the lamb could no longer be performed. And now the focus shifts in Judaism to a home-centered celebration of Passover. Fast forward then to Jesus and the early Christian communities and their understanding of Eucharist. So what happened at the Last Supper? The Last Supper is traditionally understood as a Passover or as a Seder meal. And in the traditional Seder, the matzah is eaten to commemorate the haste with which the Israelites had to flee from Egypt. So it was unleavened bread. They didn't have time to make it rise. Now, Jesus' innovation or reinterpretation was this, that he took the matzah, he broke it, he gave it to his disciples, he said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then he took the wine. In the typical Seder meal, there are 4 cups of wine drunk at different stages of the celebration. So Jesus has a reinterpretation. He takes the 3rd cup, which was the cup of redemption, and he gave thanks to the Father, and then he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And the significance of this, for Christians believe that Jesus' crucifixion happened the next day after the Last Supper. And so they believe that Jesus is the new Passover lamb. And then Jesus added a 3rd element that wasn't in the Seder meal. This was the notion of washing the feet of his disciples. In other words, it's about love and it's about service to others. So that was the Christ's interpretation, of the Seder meal during the Last Supper. You have Paul writing his first letter to the Corinthians, maybe about 30 years after Jesus died. And Paul is trying to help the early Christian community understand the theological significance of Eucharist. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul gives us one of the earliest recorded versions of the institution of Eucharist. And he says this, he says, "I am repeating what I received from the Lord, who said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' He said, this is the new covenant, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. So now the early Christian community is working with this. So Eucharist then evolves gradually from the Jewish roots of the Last Supper and the earliest Christian gatherings. Because the first Christians were all Jews who continued to observe traditional Jewish practices. But they also developed their own distinctive rituals and beliefs centered around Jesus' death and resurrection. So you don't find a fully formalized Eucharistic liturgy, but they practice a form of worship centered around agape or communal meals, love festivals. So we have Justin Martyr about the year 150, and Tom picked out a beautiful reading for us last week to illustrate this. Justin Martyr provides one of the earliest descriptions of Christian worship, including the Eucharist. So he writes that, he says, Christians gathered on Sundays for a service that included readings from the scriptures, a homily, prayers, and then the Eucharistic meal. Which brought me up to the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1562. This was a pivotal event in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was a council that was convened in response to the Protestant Reformation, which had begun to happen in 1517. And Trent was attempting to address various theological and liturgical and disciplinary issues that arose during that period. And one of the key areas, or the key areas of focus, was the Eucharist, which was a significant contention between Catholics and Protestants. And so they developed what's called the Tridentine Mass, or the Latin Mass. And it is a form of the Roman Catholic Mass that was standardized following the Council of Trent and remained the primary mode of celebration for 4 centuries, right down to our own time. And it is marked, the Latin Mass is definitely marked by the level of solemnity and the use of Latin and specific prayers and rituals, with an emphasis on Eucharist as sacrifice. Now, it was replaced in the majority of Catholic churches by what was called the Novus Ordo, the New Order, after Vatican II in 1965. Now, the Latin Mass, or the Tridentine Mass, continues to be celebrated in certain contexts today, particularly by those who wish to preserve the traditional practices of a pre-Vatican II church. Now, over the course of the papacies of Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, the status and the use of the Latin Mass underwent very significant changes. Benedict encouraged greater access to the Latin Mass, and he ruled that priests could be trained in the Latin Mass as part of their seminary formation. Francis, on the other hand, has restricted access to the Latin Mass and ruled that priests could not be trained in the Latin Mass as part of their formation. So that's what I dealt with 2 weeks ago. Last week, then, I focused on the notion of what's called the real presence. So let's go back to the Last Supper. When Jesus said, "This is my body, which is given for you, this is my blood." Obviously, the disciples didn't feel like they were eating his physical body and blood, during the Last Supper. It's not like Jesus went around the whole group and allowed each person to take a bite out of his left ear or his big toe. So when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," and he kind of dispensed it to everybody present, it obviously wasn't that they were eating Christ's physical body. So what do we mean? St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, he differentiates between 3 levels of body. 3 Greek words: sarx, soma, and pneuma. Sarx means the flesh and blood. It's the Greek from which we get the word sarcopenia, where your flesh gets wrinkled as you get older. So sarx is the physical substance. Soma is kind of the mental level of body. So we talk about psychosomatic illnesses, where the mind creates an issue in the physical body. And then you have pneuma, our spirit. We talk about the air, pneumatic tires. So something filled with air or filled with spirit. So Paul differentiates then between sarx, soma, and pneuma. And he says in his first letter to the Corinthians, when he's talking about Eucharist, he says, sarx cannot inhabit or inherit the kingdom of God. So there's no, physicality cannot get to heaven in some senses. Now, Paul then is differentiating 3 levels of body. So when we talk about real presence, this becomes very important. Hinduism has 7 different levels of body, all the way from the physical body to the etheric body to the astral body, to the mental body, to the psychical body, to the soul body, and then the cosmic consciousness itself. So when we're talking about real presence of Christ, what body are we talking about? Now, in early Christianity, there are three different kinds of real presence that are mentioned in the Gospels. So the first one is where Jesus says, where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. Now, is that a physical presence of Jesus? So we who are meeting in memory of Christ today, there's a lot more than two or three of us, is Christ present to us? And obviously, yes. Is he physically present? Can you look somewhere and say, there he is, over in the corner? So when Christ says, where two or three are gathered, there am I, what did he mean? What level of self is present for him? That's the first kind of real presence. The second kind of real presence is the notion that God and Jesus are contained in the Word of God, in the Logos, the morphogenetic kind of agent that creates form out of matter. Now, is this a physical presence as well? So this was an argument that Jesus had with the Pharisees when he called himself the Son of God. And they said to him, how dare you call yourself the Son of God? And Jesus says, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods, to those to whom the Word of God was addressed? So according to the scriptures and according to Jesus, those to whom the Word of God is addressed themselves are experiencing the real presence of God. So that's a second form of real presence. And then you have Eucharist itself, that at the moment of consecration, somehow, through transubstantiation, there's a real presence of Jesus. Now, the question is then, which of these is the most real? If they're all real presence, is there some kind of a hierarchy of presences, that one is more really present than the other? And way back in the 2nd century, probably the greatest philosopher possibly of all time, possibly even greater than Plato, a guy called Plotinus, accused Christians of being cannibals and vampires because they had secret meetings in which they claimed they were eating the body and drinking the blood of their founder. So what did real presence, Eucharistic real presence then mean? When Christians were breaking bread and drinking wine, for them it was somehow that Christ was spiritually present with them. So that early Christians understood that the Eucharist was not just a memorial, but also a means of participating in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So there's this developing belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but the exact nature of that presence was debated. And so the debate was over whether or not the bread and wine are the literal body and blood of Jesus, or whether they're symbolic representations of Christ's presence, and that would continue to evolve over the centuries. And this was the issue that Trent took up in 1546. It was a central issue of the Reformation, was the nature of Christ's presence in Eucharist. And Protestants, particularly Luther and Calvin, rejected the Catholic notion of transubstantiation. So one group believed that the Eucharist is simply a memorial. It's like you have a birthday party, so that when I'm 79 on October the 8th this year, that I have a birthday party commemorating a fact that happened 79 years ago. So it's a memorial. It's not like I'm going to get reborn on October the 8th, 2025, but that I'm going to celebrate something that happened 79 years before. So that is just a memorial. Or you think like Christmas. When you celebrate Christmas, you don't actually believe that the baby Jesus is born again in Bethlehem, in 2024. Or when you celebrate July 4th, you're not looking at kind of an independence movement, you're looking at something that happened almost 250 years before. So that the Protestant notion was that it was simply a memorial of something that happened long, long before. The second Protestant idea was that it wasn't just a memorial, it was a symbolic reenactment of something that happened. So it's like you have civil war groups, who dress up in costumes and have mock battles. So it's not just a memorial of the Civil War, but it's a symbolic reenactment of the Civil War. Or you have, a nativity play all over the world, millions of nativity plays all over the world. So it's like a symbolic reenactment of the birth of the baby Jesus 2,000 years before. Now, the Catholic viewpoint was, no, it's not just a memorial, and it's not just a symbolic reenactment. It really is Jesus, and kind of, in some sense, it's like Jesus is cloned. It's just real body and blood. And the word they used was transubstantiation. That at the moment of consecration, when the priest holds the host, it says, hoc est enim corpus meum, that suddenly what was just a piece of bread and wine is now the real presence, body and blood of Jesus Christ. Now, obviously, they got into big trouble, because obviously, if you were to do a chemical analysis or a physical examination, obviously this host does not contain the left ear or the big toe of Jesus. So they tried different words like trans-signification or trans-essentialization, but none of them really stuck. So I spoke last week then about my own dive into quantum mechanics, and I said quantum mechanics to the rescue here. It offers us insights that bring another possible kind of reinterpretation here. And I picked out just three aspects of quantum mechanics. The first is the notion of superposition. The understanding in quantum mechanics that a subatomic particle can be simultaneously present in multiple locations. So if this is true, and we're composed of billions of subatomic particles, then in some senses, every single one of us is in multiple locations all the time. So what does the real presence of Jesus then look like in quantum mechanics? It's a whole different understanding. There's a second notion in quantum mechanics called entanglement theory. And it was developed by an Irish physicist called John Bell in the 1960s. That the paired subatomic particles, which are separated even by the width of the universe itself, always remain connected. And if you change one, the other one changes immediately. You change the spin of one of them, the other immediately is changed as well. So that means that we are all connected all the time. So not only are we everywhere all the time, we're everywhere and we're connected all the time. Now, what does that say about real presence? And the third thing I want to dip into is what's called quantum information theory. Now, this actually is just a fancy modern term for what Hindus would call the Akashic records. Because quantum information theory says that no information in the cosmos is ever lost. It transcends space and it transcends time. So anything that's ever happened in the cosmos is recorded as information. Now, if that's true, then how is that affecting, the real presence of Christ in Eucharist? So here then is my own theory, building on all this stuff. I think it becomes really important, firstly, to understand that there are different levels of teaching and different levels of listening and different levels of reality. So I believe there are at least three, that there are three ways of teaching a truth or experiencing reality. And the first is literal, that you unpack something literally. And so it's data that appeal to the sensorium and to the left brain, the rational thinking. And then the second one is symbolic thinking, and that appeals to intuition and to the right brain. So the totally different modality of grokking the data. And then the third part is mystical. And this appeals to the soul and to the heart and to cosmic consciousness. So the question then becomes, at what level are you kind of interacting with reality? Because that will very, very definitely, make a difference on your understanding of the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. If you try to look at it literally, you're depending on your sensorium and you're looking at a host and your left brain to make sense of it. If you're depending on symbolism, it's appealing to your intuition and your right brain, which is more creative. And if you appeal to the mystical, you realize that you're interacting with this at the soul level, at the heart level, and at the level of cosmic consciousness. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that altered states of consciousness are key to understanding the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Because in getting into an altered state of consciousness, you're transcending time and space and matter. Now, space and time only exists in this three-dimensional physicality. It doesn't exist at higher levels. So when you're dreaming, for instance, you're out of space and you're out of time. So you can meet Jesus then at many different levels. You can meet him at a physical level, at an etheric level, at an astral level, at a mental level, at a causal level, at a soul level, or at a source level. So it depends very much on your state of consciousness, what the encounter is going to look like. And I gave the example of a young kid coming up to communion when you were still serving Eucharist on the tongue and sticking his tongue out, and there's a big wad of chewing gum in it. And I put the host in his mouth. Did that kid have an encounter with Jesus? Was Jesus really present to the kid? Absolutely not. It was a piece of bread and a piece of chewing gum wrestling for space in his mouth. As distinct from somebody who comes up and really understands what this is about and it's in an altered state of consciousness, and I put the wafer on somebody's tongue, and there's a real encounter takes place between that person and Christ. There's a real presence right there and then. So we then have respect for the host in the same way that you respect the national flag. The national flag it's a piece of cloth, but we're not kind of honoring it just for the piece of cloth. We're honoring it because it elevates our patriotic spirit. It represents the American spirit. And I talked about what happened in my city in Cork when I was a child on the Feast of Corpus Christi every year. All of the men of the city and the suburbs, over 30,000 men, would assemble in their individual churches and then march into the city centre, and there would be the host would be held in a monstrance by the bishop. So you got 30,000 men. Can you imagine the mystical energy of 30,000 people making Christ really present by elevating beyond the materialistic science and the five senses into their soul selves, and thus encountering Christ in his soul self? I talked about the notion of Flatland, this great novel in the 1880s, where a three-dimensional object like a sphere encounters a two-dimensional reality, like squares and circles, and triangles and stuff like that. And the three-dimensional object trying to convince the two-dimensional plane that three dimensions exist. So trying to kind of represent a 3D reality in a 2D detection. And we had this problem with early art. Early on in Europe, they had no sense of perspective. When you looked at a painting, you were obviously looking at a 2D reality. And then at some stage, they created the notion of perspective. And now you could build into a painting a 3D perspective. So that's what you're trying to do. Now with Eucharist, we're trying to express and understand a multi-dimensional reality with three-dimensional depictions. And this is the problem if we don't change our state of consciousness. Last week, I asked you to do the following exercise, and I repeat it just for a few moments now. I want you now to close your eyes, and I want you to pray the Our Father in your own mother tongue. I'll play it in Gaelic in my mind. So pray the Our Father in your own mother tongue with your eyes closed. Now, what image of God did you create as you prayed it? Do you believe that God is real? Was God really hearing, listening, and processing your mental words? So, what does the real presence of God look like to you? Was it a literal? Was it symbolic? Was it mystical? And so, what does the real presence of Jesus look like to you? Is it literal? Is it symbolic? Or is it mystical? I want you now to cover your own eyes for a moment. Just cover your own eyes for a few seconds. What does your own real presence of yourself look like with your eyes closed? When you think of you, you say, I. What does your real presence look like? Is it your physical body? Is it your emotions? Is it your thoughts? Is it your important relationships? Is it your profession? And you realize that all of these are just 3D projections of your own multidimensional self. So my habit very often at the end of a homily, I say Namaste, which is the Hindu greeting, which means the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. So I want to just change it this morning. In other words, what I'm saying to you is this. I'm saying my own real presence, my inner divinity, recognizes and honors your real presence, your inner divinity. So let's open it up to Q&A.
When Jesus at the Last Supper said, this is my body, do you think that maybe also he was saying, this is my body, everything is my body, I'm everything, I'm God, I'm everywhere, I'm with you. That was a much broader thing than what we usually interpret it as?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right on. So I think of Jesus as, you know, the greatest teacher humanity has ever seen. He's a child of God, just like you are a child of God. But that Jesus recognized his inner divinity and the divinity of all others. So I've kind of, my definition of Christ consciousness is that Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all that exists. And so Christ is operating in that modality. And so this isn't just a kind of a symbol. It's not just a memorial. Christ is saying, when you see anything, you see everything. You know, Christ would say, for instance, look at the lilies of the field. They don't spin or weave or gather into barns. And yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his finery looked as good as one of these. So, you know, when you know how to look, it doesn't matter where you look. You'll find everything. If you don't know how to look, it doesn't matter where you look, you're not going to find anything. And Christ is doing what the Buddha did 550 years before him. He's saying, if you really know how to look, not just with your sensorium, but with your soul self, you'll see the inner divinity of everything. And you'll see that, you know, in some senses, God herself has made a sacrifice by allowing herself to be fractured into netzotzim, into soul cells that would experience three-dimensional reality. And so that is what Christ is saying at the Last Supper, in my opinion.
Seán, this was triggered by the word recorded when we were talking about, when you were talking about quantum information theory and the Akashic records. I heard a homily once that was titled, In God There Is No Time.
Right.
And so past, future, present, all that we think of as the information that's out there already exists simultaneously in God.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that in terms of predestination versus free will.
Okay, brilliant. So obviously, just to start at the end and work my way backwards, Tom, I obviously do not believe in predestination, that this is a kind of a mirage, and so that we don't have free will. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't believe that life is a drama which is pre-programmed, that we're robotic creatures, you know, given particular lines and a kind of a particular plot. Life is in improv theater. I told you one time I had a client at my psychology practice who was a professional actor, and his focus was improv theater. And he said, you'd go on stage with another actor and look at the audience and say, give us a word. And the audience would just throw them a word, chimney. And now you and I on stage have to make up a drama about chimney. And he said there were two rules to it. The first thing is that you have to work with any line you're given by your partner. I can't say to you, Tom, that was a stupid thing to say. What can I say about a chimney? I can't do that. I have to work with every line you give me. And the second rule he said is that you have to feed your partner lines that play to his strengths, knowing that he'll be able to handle this one. And if I'm playing to your strength and you're playing to my strength, then the drama is going to take off. But it is improv theater. It's not like a Shakespearean drama that we have to learn the lines and follow the script. It is not like that whatsoever. So the difference between free will and predestination is that we are totally free to choose the game we want to play. But once we agree to a particular game, we have to abide by the rules. So some people then say we can't have free will, if there are rules. That's not true. If you decide you want to be an athlete and you're thinking, do I want to play soccer or baseball or rugby or hurling? Which one do I want to play? You look at the games, you say, if I play soccer, there's only 11 people on each team. Only one person can handle the ball. I can't be offside, and the ball is spherical. If I decide to play baseball, there's a whole different group of people on the field, and there's a bat, and the ball is much smaller, and there's much smaller rules. If I decide to play NFL football, I can tackle somebody and knock him to the ground, but I'm not allowed to do that in soccer. And so I choose the game I want to play. But once I choose the game, I then agree to abide by the rules of the game. And so when people say, I don't have free will, they don't understand what it is. You freely chose to be here now. Nobody forced you. You chose to be a participant in this game at this stage of human history. And now, within the constraints of the rules of incarnation, you have to kind of make the decisions that create love. So I don't believe in predestination whatsoever. And so what Christ is saying then, is that you've chosen to incarnate in order to generate experiences for God herself. And every one of us is going to find ourselves in circumstances in which the contributions of 8 billion other people are creating ripples on the pond into which we've incarnated. So everything I think, everything I say, everything I do is part of the mix. It's part of the information. Now, I want to create a distinction then as well between data and information. They're slightly different. Data are just, if I give you the alphabet, 26 symbols in English, that's just raw data. It's meaningless. But if I give you a bunch of those data in a particular form, if I spell out, for instance, LOVE, I've turned data into information. And so it's the kind of manipulation of data that creates information. So every one of us is capable of putting data into the field. And then the Akashic record is recording that as information. And the same thing as quantum information theory. That the words, what the stars are doing, what the planets are doing, what the black holes in space are doing, what human beings are doing, what bunny rabbits are doing, all that is feeding data into quantum information theory, which is turning it into information. And that is the water in which we're swimming as human beings. So we're completely free to choose the game, and we've chosen the game. And now we agree to abide by the rules in order to maximize the learning for everybody.
So if you're asking if God is everything and nothing, and all in between, and knows everything that we will do and what will happen, that is not necessarily already recorded in the Akashic records, which happens at a much lower energy level that's associated with our incarnation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the problem is that we're stuck in a 3D analysis of data which are coming from much higher. So to talk about time or space is meaningless. So to say God pre-knows what's going to happen and therefore we don't have the free will. All we're doing is, from the potentiality that exists, we're free to choose a particular timeline. And I believe that faced with any significant decision in your life bifurcates. So there's one lifetime, one timeline in which you're following through on having chosen A and the consequences of having chosen A. And there's a pre-existing also a timeline where you chose B and you spun off another timeline. In fact, so we're spinning off a multiplicity of timelines every time we make an important decision. And therefore the cosmos itself is spinning off this multiplicity of possibilities. And so God is not addicted to any particular interpretation. You're free to choose which path to take when you reach a bifurcation point in a wood. Am I going to go to the left or to the right? You're completely free. And then God is going to kind of gather the data from the experiences you're having, and it becomes part of God. And then the final thing I would say to you, Tom, is that we have to differentiate between a kind of a pantheistic notion of God and a panentheistic notion of God. Pantheism is the belief system that God is the sum total of all that exists. I don't believe in that. I believe in panentheism, that God is the sum total of all that exists and a lot more besides. And the example I use is that, there's a lot more to Shakespeare than his collected works. Shakespeare is not just somebody who wrote sonnets and plays. He was a father, perhaps. He was a husband. He was a sibling. He was a gardener or whatever he was. So there's a lot more to Shakespeare than his collected works. And there's a lot more to God than her collected works. So we have to step outside of this notion of spatial differentiation or time likes.
I'm curious as to how we should assimilate the Eucharist. The reason we receive it each week is because of just our disconnection from God and Source in between now and then. Well, how should we assimilate the Eucharist, like on Tuesday or Friday when we've received it today?
Okay, that's brilliant. So the important thing then, Kim, is that if I can get into an altered state of consciousness today in the Eucharistic encounter, and I have to say that in spite of all my personal faults as a human, I never celebrate Eucharist without getting into an altered state of consciousness. In 53 years as a priest, I've never celebrated a single Eucharist in which I wasn't in an altered state of consciousness, in which I didn't have an encounter with the real Christ. And so for me, that encounter lasts throughout the week, even if I might celebrate Mass on Sundays with a group of people. The energy of connection to a source self, permeates everything I think and do and say during the week. I make mistakes, obviously. There are times when I forget about it, but just even hearkening back to the experience of the Sunday and the connection that exists, that bleeds into everything else that happens during the week. So the fact that you have, this signal point, it's like you're going off into the desert but you have a GPS system that reminds you where the home base was. So no matter what kind of windstorms come up, you have a GPS system that will bring you back to the home base, no matter how lost you got in the process. And for me, that's what Eucharist does. Eucharist par excellence is kind of the energy created in a mass for me, which is my GPS system, that no matter how lost I get or how much I forget who I am and who you are and who Jesus is, that it brings me right back to there by just remembering what happened on Sunday. Yeah.
When I close my eyes and don't engage with any thought,
Good.
I'm just present, I'm just here.
Yes.
And I don't feel anything. I feel the vacuum.
Yes.
That is the presence, that is consciousness.
Yes.
And
yes.
that is God for me,
Yes.
right?
That's beautiful.
Now, nowadays, in my community, we are talking a lot about evolutionary consciousness.
Yes.
And I have a little problem with that. And just tomorrow, we'll have a Zoom with a group of them, and I am the facilitator. And we are going to talk about evolutionary consciousness.
Right.
I don't know, I have a sense that we don't know what it is.
Yeah, brilliant question, Gladys. So I start at the end and then work my way backwards in some senses. So as I said earlier on, I have a practice of seeding my dreams at night. Before I go to sleep at night, I pose a question that I want my higher consciousness to address. And the question I had was, what is Christ consciousness? And the answer I got in my dream was that Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all beings. Now, so that's kind of Tyler de Chardin's point to omega. That's, if you want to talk about an evolutionary trajectory or the evolution of consciousness, that is the end point. That's point omega, developing Christ consciousness. Now, in the process, we're going to kind of encounter various stages of that. And the best articulation of that I've ever found is the Hindu model that suggests that there are 7 different levels of consciousness. The first level is, I kind of am identified with my physical body and my physical brain. I think, that consciousness is created by this kind of 3 pounds massive wetware that I carry between my ears, and that's consciousness. That is the neuronal activity and the circuitry of my brain, that's what consciousness is. So that's a physical kind of identification. There's a place beyond that in Hinduism, they call it the etheric body, the elan vital. And it's the thing that they use in homeopathy, and energy medicines, or in kind of, what do you call it, acupuncture, or activating so that's kind of an etheric energy flow. That's a higher level of body. And that's the level of your physical body that's actually going to create, or create difficulties for your physical health. If your etheric body is not healthy, your physical body is going to pay the price eventually. So that will be a second level of consciousness. But for most of us, it's out of our awareness. The third level is the astral body. And the astral body, according to Hinduism, does 2 things. It's the place you visit when you're dreaming at night. And it's beyond time and space. There is no time and there's no space when you're dreaming. And in fact, if you become aware that you're dreaming, if there's lucid dreaming, the test of lucid dreaming, you can learn how to do this. If you're dreaming and you become aware of the fact, I think I'm dreaming, and you want to test, am I dreaming or am I awake? This is a very simple test. You reach your hand out and you touch a solid object. And if your hand goes through the object, you're dreaming. And if it doesn't, you're not dreaming. And so what does that tell you? It tells you that in the astral body, there's neither time, space, nor even matter. Matter doesn't exist because your hand went right through it. So that's to be the third level of consciousness. The fourth level will be the mental body. They're at the place of Plato's ideal realms. They're the archetypes. The archetypes that give birth to the complexes, in the physical body and the emotional body. So that'll be the fourth level of body. The fifth level body then is the psychic body, the place where every single one of us has psychic abilities, but we haven't developed them. Clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, precognition, psychokinesis, telepathy, these kinds of things. So that's the level of body then where there's a totally different level of consciousness. And at this level as well, we have precognition about stuff. I had a friend of mine, Roger Nelson, who's a brilliant scientist, and there was a group of us met every year in Esalen Institute. It was called the D. Mills Group, Distant Mental Influences on Living Systems. And it's looking at ways in which, human beings' consciousness can be kind of impacted. And I was there because I had done a study on the effects of intercessory prayer at a distance on self-esteem, anxiety, and depression. So I was part of that group. There was a guy called Roger Nelson who created random number generators, and he had one in the room when we were meeting. And I was just spitting out zeros and ones, binary mathematics. And we wanted to find out whether we could kind of create a pattern in the random data, depending on the topic under discussion or the energy generated in the room. And he subsequently did a worldwide experiment where he had hundreds of random number generators scattered all over the world. And then he watched what happened to the randomization process. And when any great significant event was about to occur, like before 9/11 or the death of President, before she died, there was a huge spike. The random data all suddenly created some kind of order. The randomness was gone and there was order created. So that somehow, human consciousness is precognitive and it can respond to stuff which hasn't yet happened. And Roger could pick it up with these random number generators. So that's the psychic body, that's level number 5. And number 6 then is the soul self itself. So that is the bite-sized piece of God that God spun off in order to generate experiences. And then the final level of consciousness is divine knowledge itself. So when I think of consciousness then, I'm thinking of the ascendance through all of these stages. And that's the place then where something that can induce an altered state of consciousness, like a Eucharistic encounter or an entheogen, or meditation or drumming or dancing or whatever, can move us through those stages of consciousness. So we realize that the brain does not create consciousness. In fact, the brain is a reducer of consciousness. There's a part of the brain back here called the reticular activating system, which kind of censors the incoming data so that the brain doesn't get overpowered by too much income. So it censors stuff and says, we'll only attend to that which is important. And then it sends only the important information to the left brain and to the cerebral cortex to process it. But the vast bulk of the data isn't processed at all. So, as you think then about facilitating this group, maybe that might be a map that you might find helpful, that these are the different levels of consciousness, and that the evolution of consciousness is somehow finding techniques to move ourselves to higher and higher levels of consciousness.
Consciousness does not evolve, because I had maybe the last stage of consciousness. In that way, consciousness evolves, but the ultimate presence does not evolve. God does not evolve.
The difference is our access to consciousness evolves as we learn different techniques. Consciousness itself is always present. So it's now we're evolving into consciousness, is that we're discovering the pre-existing consciousness, which has always been and always will be.
You mentioned the different ways that we could access altered senses, before receiving Eucharist.
Right.
One of them was holotropic breath, and my
Yes.
understanding is Stanislav Grof kind of reverse engineered some of the stuff he witnessed when people were taking plant medicine.
Yes.
And I understand that breath and spirit is the same word in many languages. So
Yes.
you're inspiring, you're breathing in the spirit. I've been lucky enough to access an altered state there a couple of times, like in my life, and it was like heaven on earth. But does God want that to be like a temporary panacea for our pain? Because we can't stay in that state all the time. Is this like a temporary panacea? Okay, well, now you go about your mission, and you experience that occasionally, and it's not always, especially with breath, you can't guarantee it, right? But is that just the experience that heaven? Because I've read about people that have near-death experiences and come back with a kind of depression. It's like, dealing with life on earth. So is that meant to be a temporary just panacea, for want of a better word?
So I think maybe if we change the word panacea, because panacea is a temporary cure for something. The truth is that it is a memory that's meant to kind of go so deep into our souls that even in the middle of the darkness, we can still remember the light. And so our job when we incarnate is to kind of survive in three-dimensional density and still remember who we are. And so there's this great passage in one of the creedal formulations where it says that after Jesus died, he descended into hell. Now, what in God's name does that mean? It means that Christ was able to risk, total disconnection from source, not just in a 3D density, not just even in a horrific torture death, but that he could go down even deeper into places where there's utter darkness, in a sense that the knowledge of God has been snuffed out in some way, and be some kind of a light bearer that could reignite even that level of densification so that it too could remember. And then you and I are tasked with, remembering while we're in these, spacesuits, that these occasional mystical experiences are meant to kind of sustain us, that they're the GPS that says, this is not your final home. This was something you volunteered to do. This was a task you undertook, realizing that it was really dangerous, really painful, and that sometimes you'd even forget why you were here, that you'd even begin to gaslight yourself and say, was it really real? Was I fooling myself? And realize, no, my soul knows this in a way that my mind does not. Great question, Damien.
I got a vision of multi-dimensions, like literally floors, only each one was a bit transparent. And I got this sense that we have many lives, but there's always an over self, that we can become apparently conscious of another self. But we're in this physical body at this time, and the others can be affected. We can affect everything that we have been by what we are now. I've just gone through this really intense experience of realizing how much I've chosen this life, and that it affects more than this life. It affects my other incarnations and what I will be as well. I don't see it, of course, in a multidimensional way, but I'm really feeling like we live in one life that we may be conscious of at a time, but it is learning from other lives, and it is affecting other lives, kind of like an oversoul effect.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because ultimately there is only source. Ultimately there is only God. It exists as a bite-sized piece of God that volunteered for separation and for experiences. And so it's like, I take an example, for instance, of let's say a pregnant woman. So she's growing a baby. At the same time, she's at the sink washing dishes, and she's singing a song. So she's engaged in 3 totally different activities. So it's not like that one is interfering with the other, that she's retarding her baby's growth by washing the dishes, or that she's kind of taking her mind away from her baby by singing a song, so that she's totally capable of multiple activities, of many, many things. And that's true of the soul as well. The soul is manipulating many previous lifetimes, because there is no past actually. So they're all present right now. And so you're the interface between many concurrent incarnations, and everybody else who's being incarnated. You're all feeding into each other. So ultimately, there is only God. One of the prayers I say at night is, there is only God, there is only love. Everything that exists is simply an experience that God is having through Netzotzim. So everything is interconnected. So here again, we have the notion of entanglement theory and superposition of souls. Nothing is separated from anything.
My question is about altered states of consciousness. When you are trying to get into a meditative state, often it's that gamma brainwave, which is what we have when we are in REM sleep, and being able to maintain that in an awake state. And my question is, do you think that all methods of reaching the altered state of consciousness are equally as positive? So I've seen a lot of people with energy fields that really look like Swiss cheese, because they've engaged in plant medicine and they have entity attachments and they have holes blown out in their fields. And so I'm wondering what your personal feeling is about, using something other than prayer and meditation to reach that altered state of consciousness, having it be a hallucinogenic or a plant medicine.
That's a great question. Great question, Kelsey. And so there are 2 factors to it. The first one is that it is idiosyncratic, that there are things that will work for one person that won't work for another person. I've got some really good friends, for instance, deeply spiritual people, and they can't meditate. They don't know how to do it. When they try it, it's completely boring. And so the first factor is idiosyncratic. You find out, what works for you, what moves you into an altered state of consciousness. The second thing is that once you begin to play around with altered states of consciousness, you're opening yourself up to all kinds of forces. So you have to be really, really careful what you're doing. And so in Hinduism, there's this great notion of, they call them the Siddhis, Siddhi. The Siddhi is kind of the extraordinary gifts attendant upon spiritual evolution. And Hinduism says, don't get attached to the Siddhis. It's not about the Siddhis, it's about finding source. And so people, for instance, who can pray in tongues, or people who have kind of the ability to cast out demons, or people who have kind of healing capacities, and they're attached to those, you know. And so the journey is not about the kind of the accidental kinds of gifts or abilities that happen as a result of the journey. The object of the exercise is the journey itself, to go back to God. And so anytime that you enter an altered state of consciousness, whatever the modality it is that you utilize to get there, now you're playing where the big boys and the big girls are playing. You're playing now with energies which are much more powerful than you. And so, for instance, one of the last prayers I do at night, you know, when I'm about to go to sleep, I say, I'm going to travel from my physical body to my etheric, to my astral higher. And I know I'm going to encounter discombobulated entities, almost like a kind of the belt between Mars and Jupiter, the asteroid belt, which is really, really dangerous for our kind of satellites going through there. You're going through a minefield. I realize there are all these discombobulated entities and dark forces. And so I say, don't get me into stuff that I can't handle. And I want to be under the protection of angelic beings, but I want to be of assistance to those beings who are stuck there. But I'd be really, really careful that I'm now playing, I've gone from a T-ball to major league kind of baseball. I have to realize now I'm going to be up against really, really powerful batters here in the stage. So I have to be really careful that I'm surrounded with people who can teach me how to play this game well, and that I don't get addicted to the successes, you know, or the cities that are attached to it. So the other two responses I make. Great question.
My question has to do with 8 levels of body. And when you were talking about dreaming in the astral realm, you were talking about how matter doesn't exist. And so I was thinking about that in terms of our relationships with different people in our lives, wondering if, in fact, we engage some people at a certain level and other people at another level and other people at another level. And if that notion of coming to the true namaste realization, we need travel up that ladder in our relationships with people.
That's a brilliant question, Carolina. And so the example, the kind of the image that came to me as you were asking your question is this, that we're going to meet people in life, you know, whom we have encountered many, many times in our past in previous incarnations, or maybe at earlier stages of this incarnation. And therefore, every relationship has a hook that digs into us. And so if a relationship kind of brings back a memory where I was abused as a child, yeah, I'm going to flip into that child fearful place or angry place against somebody who's perpetrated an injustice against me. So I'm going to get hooked constantly by previous encounters in this incarnation with individuals, and I'm going to get hooked by previous incarnations where this other person and I, you know, shared some kind of a life together. So I have to be really, really careful, you know, that as I'm ascending into Christ consciousness, these things are coming to the surface in order to be healed. It's not that, wow, I haven't made a whole lot of progress. It's that, you know, here's the diagnostic right now. You know, taking a kind of a view of your kind of yourself, and here are the spots that need dealing with. Yeah, your liver is problematic, or your immune system is compromised in some way. And so they're actually invitations for us to kind of, on the basis of the diagnosis, to create a healing modality and therefore a better prognosis for myself. So every single one of these actually is an invitation to further growth. And the fact that I seem to be regressing because of a particular encounter or relationship means that there's still unfinished business there that I haven't healed from. So rather than seeing it as a regression, as to going backwards, that I'm actually dealing with stuff that didn't get quite cleared up, you know, in the previous encounter. Yeah, so it's really positive.